Good afternoon. My guest today is Professor Roderick Beaton. He's Emeritus Corres Professor of Modern Greek and Byzantine Literature, History, Literature and Language at King's College. And the reason why we're here is to discuss two of his most recent books. The one is the most recent one that also came out in Greek, was published in Greek by Patakis. The title is Greece, Biography of a Modern Nation. And a few years ago, he published another book that was also translated into Greek, Byron's War, which, as the title indicates, it's about Byron's role in the Greek Revolution, which we will be celebrating the 200 years in a few months. Hi, Roddy. I shouldn't hide the fact that apart from having this discussion with you, we're also old friends.
Well, I was just going to say, Harris, yes. I mean, we have met on many occasions, and you're indeed a good friend, and it's a great pleasure to be with you on this occasion.
Yeah, good. Well, in the past, because we didn't have the virus, we could actually meet in person. So unfortunately,
I so wish we could. I so wish we could. I miss Greece, being locked down here in the North Kent coast in England, and clearly, sadly, neither of us is in Thessaloniki. Perhaps you are, but Alifora.
Okay. We're going to carry on this discussion in English, but of course, you're more than welcome if you want to turn into Greek at some point. Well, I have a few questions which combine both books, both the recent one, the Greece Biography of a Modern Nation, and the Byron one. But the first question I have for you is that in the English-speaking world, as you know, there are at least two concise histories of modern Greece, which I know. The older one by C.M. Woodhouse, and a more recent, but also, I suppose, quite old, by Richard Clogg. And in addition, we have a number of books that examine in more depth various periods of modern Greek history, such as the books by Mark Mazaur, David Brewer, David Close, Woodhouse again, two books on the Civil War, John Iatridis, John Campbell and Philip Sherrod, and others. And here I'm referring to non-Greek historians, because probably, as you know, in the last years we had the publication in Greek of two, again, books that cover the entire period of modern Greek history, one by Kostas Kostis, Τα κακομαθημένα παιδιά της ιστορίας, which was also translated in English, so it's available to British and American readers, and more recently one by Antonis Liakos. So my first question to you is, what new do you think that your book brings to the existing historiography of modern Greece? How does it enrich or challenge or even deconstruct the accounts that we have of the modern Greek nation? To put it simply, we know you as a man related to Greek literature. What made you write this book? I mean, to become a historian at this point.
Okay, well, I think that's probably several questions in one, Harris. Thank you for that. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's probably rather interesting. I mean, a surprising number of scholars in the English-speaking world have written on the history of modern Greece, and there are, I think there are either 4 or 5 short histories of modern Greece currently available in English. You mentioned 2 of them, and I believe, Richard Clogg's book was first published many years ago, but the 4th edition has been announced for next year, which I have no doubt will bring the story, pretty close to the 200 years since the Greek Revolution. There's an excellent short book by Stathis Kalivas called Greece, or Modern Greece, What Everybody Needs to Know. That's published in a uniform series by Oxford University Press. Mm-hmm. But he packs, it is a very short book and it's in a standard format, but he packs an amazing amount into it and has a very distinctive take on the subject. And as you say, the fullest short history of modern Greece we have is the one by Kostas Kostis, the Kakomathimena Pedia, which has now been published in English as well. So yes, it is a crowded field, and it perhaps won't surprise you if I tell you, because, I mean, these are all very good books, and I wasn't even aspiring to compete with them. And, there's no point in repeating what someone else has already done. So right from the start, when I embarked on this, my idea was to write about modern Greece, in the history of modern Greece, but in a different way. And I think there are two ways in which that's perhaps most obvious in the book as it now exists. First of all, in the title, but it goes beyond the title, namely, I didn't call it a history.
Yeah, I was going to come to that. You call it a biography.
Well, I mean, I called it a biography because, well, okay, I mean, I can perhaps explain more about that, but even ιδεολογικά, in terms of its genre, it's not the same kind of book as Clog or Gallant or Kalivas or Koliopoulos and Varemis or Kostis.
Yeah.
And we can talk more about that if you like. And the other was, I mean, I noticed in his introduction, Kostas Kostis says, a history of modern Greece has to be a history of the modern Greek state. And he says something like, I don't quite see how else it could be done. Now,
well, you want to focus on the nation, the people.
Yeah, I mean, someone might say, actually, I'm not sure that maybe Beaton didn't actually do something different, but I wanted to get the nation in the title. Mm-hmm. And one of the themes that I became very engaged with and actually learned a lot in the course of writing the book was the interplay, the interaction, and sometimes downright contradiction between the nation and the state. And in hindsight, I think I perhaps focused more on the state than I might have liked to do. In something I've been writing more recently, I hope I've corrected that balance. But it's absolutely not limited to the Greek state. And as I say, one of the big themes in my mind is, first of all, as we say, the synchronicity to ethnos, the sort of consolidation of the idea of a nation, but also the practical creation of a state, which I discovered is not at all the same thing,
Are you perhaps on more dangerous grounds or kind of shaky grounds if you actually, instead of actually focusing on the state, you focus on the nation? But since we're having this discussion on the nation, I want to the second thing, I want to ask you, which is related to the title, because you say, as you said, biography of a modern nation. You say in the book that, one can imagine the nation as a living person. And so therefore, if it's a living person, then it could be the subject of a biography. And somehow you keep saying that the life of this nation, the specific nation, the Greek nation, is fascinating. And there are some analogies between the nation and the individual. There may be some organic metaphors there. And therefore, that you're going to trace the history of the nation as if that nation is a subject. Now, my question is, as you know, we don't write biographies about any individual. We write biographies only of individuals that somehow we find their lives fascinating or they intrigue us in some manner. So what is it so specific about this nation that you treat it as, a kind of, I suppose, a very gifted or very unique individual?
Well, yes, I mean, well, that kind of goes without saying. I mean, obviously, the modern culture and history and people of Greece has really been my life work. So at least in my subjective estimation, there could be no grander or more exciting subject for a biography. I mean, I have
but it's one thing to say that because your interest is modern Greek, let's say, culture and literature and stuff like that, you turn to the history of the nation. But it's quite another to say that this nation, I mean, you use, if I remember well, you can correct me on that, sometimes in the book you say that, the Greek nation is a pioneer.
Yeah.
And sometimes you say that even the Greek nation has been used as a guinea pig, sapiramatouzo. Let's see. So in what sense are the Greeks protopori, pioneers? Because when we go to the other questions I have about the Greek Revolution, one can say that at the same time that the Greek Revolution was taking place, we had other revolutions taking place in Latin America at the same time. So, you know, of course the Greek Revolution is important for us as Greeks, but, you know, if you look at world history, there are many revolutions that took place at the same time, and these revolutions are, of course, unique for the peoples which, you know, this revolution was, you know, it's about. I mean, people that liberated themselves, let's say, from the Spanish Empire. What is it, why do you think that, you know, this nation, I insist on that, why do you think that this nation, for example, is a nation, as you mentioned, as you say again and again, a pioneer? Why?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that context because, you know, there are two famous revolutions that come before the Greek, the American and the French, 1776, 1789. Everybody knows about those. Everybody talks about those. Those are the paradigmatic revolutions. The American Revolution gave us the United States with all its wonderful and less wonderful things. Today, the French Revolution, I'm always a little nervous saying this in front of my French friends, but I cannot really believe that the French Revolution was a success. It made its mark on history and it changed probably the whole course of history. But in terms of, you know, its outcome, it ended up somewhat quite different from what the revolutionists intended. Napoleon called himself an emperor. He conquered most of Europe. You know, the old liberty, equality, fraternity kind of got left behind. So the successful revolutions before the 1820s were all in the New World. They were in North America, and the series of South American revolutions against Iberian rule, either Spanish or Portuguese, between about 1811 and I think 1825 was the last of them. So successful revolutions which create new nation states actually begin in the Old World. In Europe, there were several revolutions in 1820 to 1821, in Spain, in Naples, the so-called Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, in Piemonte, and there was another planned by the Carbonari, the revolutionary movement in northern Italy, for 1821, which never happened at all. None of these lasted for more than a couple of years at the most. They came to nothing. The Greek Revolution, on the other hand, led to the creation of a new state, which I insist was a nation state. And that nation state was formally recognized by the great powers of the day by international treaty on the 3rd of February 1830. That was the first new nation state to be created outside the Americas. Just think of the list, a very partial list, of new nation states that emerged in the Old World after 1830, after Greece.
How about Belgium and Switzerland?
I'm coming to Belgium and Switzerland. 1831, Belgium, fully recognized in 1838. 1848, the Swiss Confederation. The big examples that everybody quotes, the biggest nation states of Europe, the ones that did the most to change the kind of map of Europe, Italy and Germany. The unifications began in Italy, 1859, Germany, but you know, through the 1860s. Both are formally completed in 1871. Think of the Balkans. The only other nation state, Greece is the only nation state in the Balkans until 1878, when the Congress of Berlin recognizes Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania. You get Bulgaria in 1908. Albania, I think 1913, it's first recognized. Ireland in 1922, Turkey in 1923, take it all the way through to you know, in the aftermath of both world wars. After the Cold War, the breakup of Yugoslavia, we see the creation of, I think, of all the former Yugoslav states, probably the newest is Kosovo, recognized in 2008.
But Roddy, if I can insist on that, it's just that this uniqueness that you mentioned may lead to some kind of misconceptions. For example, one can say, and we know that the Greek Revolution was won through the intervention of the great powers, and then that independence that we won was compromised in many ways. And it was compromised, an easy example would be by the imposition of a Bavarian Catholic monarch on the Greek people. So in that sense, you know, if you say unique, a reader may actually get the impression that unique would also mean that we can use that revolution as an example of revolution, although I think there are other nations that had revolutions which were, in a way, the result of that revolution was the creation of an independent state. But when we say independent, you know, we actually mean the word. Whereas we won our independence, at, you know, paying a very heavy price in the sense of the state that was created afterwards.
Yeah. First of all, Karis, let's be clear about this. I did not say unique. In fact, I insist it was precisely not unique.
Okay.
It was the first of many, but it was the first in Europe of those many.
I think you use the way that the word pioneer was translated was protopori, and that's what I meant actually when I don't want to insist on the word unique, but protopori in the term.
No, absolutely. I mean the idea of pioneer is. I didn't actually check. I mean. Scapaneas. Scapaneas was the word I was, the Greek word I would use here.
Yeah.
And I do mention this in the book. I mean, the logic of the pioneer is that, you're only a pioneer if, that's the advance guard of the army. You're only a pioneer if the actual main army follows after you.
Yeah.
And it's in that sense exactly that I think Greece was the pioneer.
But we do read in many memoirs of the Greek fighters for the revolution. For example, Kolokotronis, in his memoirs, he mentions that, for him, the great event in his life, and he took the lead from that, was the French Revolution. We know that, a lot of intellectuals like Ferreos and Correis, etc., were very much affected by the French Revolution. We know that the constitutions we had, the Sidagmata, were actually drafted, in a way imitating the French one. So in that sense, you can see that the Greek Revolution it's linked to all the other revolutions that followed, and the intellectual kind of ferment that went around is connected with that.
That is exactly my point, guys. It is. It's part of it's a kind of rolling program that begins with America in 1776, gathers momentum with the Bastille in 1789. But, I do insist on this. The French Revolution did not, in the short or medium term, succeed.
Okay.
So, the Greek Revolution, it's part of a process. And the other thing, again, to avoid misunderstanding, I'm not claiming at all that the Greeks invented the nation state. They didn't.
Yeah. I will come back to the idea of the nation because I like this kind of, as you said at the beginning of our discussion, the fact that you wrote the book from that kind of angle. I want for a minute, if I can, move to the Byron book, which I found it extremely exciting and valuable in a sense because as a reader, I learned a lot, and one of the things that that readers will get from that book, which I think most of us don't know, was the role played by Shelley in persuading Byron to come to Greece, because at that point Byron was also contemplating, to go and fight in Latin America when we had a revolution just taking place across where he was living at the time in Italy. So it seems that the person that we should feel grateful to is Shelley. I think he was the true revolutionary. He was the enlightened person in that company of romantic poets. It wasn't Trelawney the adventurer or Byron. It was probably Shelley at the center of everything, and it was Shelley who persuaded Byron to come over. The information that you give us, which I did not know until I read the book, is that Mavrokordatos was actually teaching Mary Shelley Greek, and perhaps even Shelley Greek. And therefore Mavrokordatos was part of that kind of company, and perhaps through Mavrokordatos, Shelley began to know what was happening in Greece.
Well, first of all, yes, I'm glad you take out of my book that. I'm glad you take that out of my book, because that's. I'm making an argument there that is. It's a view that's not necessarily shared, or perhaps not as strongly shared, by the majority of specialists on Byron. But I thought the personal interplay between these two romantic poets of completely different temperament, inclination, who come together, and it's a tortuous, tempestuous relationship. And, as you say, I mean, Shelley is the absolute idealist. Byron is not an idealist. I mean, he's very much a realist. Yeah.
It seems to me, because as it happens in the last couple of years, I'm actually preparing a book on Shelley, and so I'm researching a lot on Shelley. It seems to me that Byron at the time was trying to find an escape route because he was absolutely bored with his life. And to put it bluntly, I think he was tired of poetry, of poesy, as he used to say, and he was probably trying to find a way out and a heroic death. And that heroic death could have happened in Bolivia, if he went to Bolivia, as he was planning, or as it happened, he died in Missolonghi.
Well, I mean, that is one of the, that's a widely diffused view, and I think it probably goes back to not long afterwards. And it has been argued that, he was tired of life, he was aging prematurely, and he does tellingly say in a letter something, every one of my projects lately has failed. As always, he was exaggerating, but he probably was looking for a change. But I don't myself for a moment buy this idea that he went either as an adventurer or to seeking out a heroic death.
I'm just saying, I'm just mentioning that, Roddy, because he has a line in his last poem when he becomes, he's celebrating his 36th birthday. That's the last poem he wrote in Missolonghi, if I'm not wrong, in January of 1924.
Or 1824, yes.
Yeah, 1824, yeah. There is a line there about the soldier's grave.
That's right, the Let Me Find. But, yes, and the way I read that, actually, you implied this yourself a moment ago, that poem is not a farewell to life, it's a farewell to the poet's life, to his life as a poet. Because by the time he got to Greece, I do also believe he had moved away from poetry. But I don't think he went to Greece to die. I think he went to Greece in order to make his mark on history, in order to take an active part, to shape the world in a way that even the most influential poet, which he was by that time, couldn't do by his verses alone. And I don't know whether this is ever quite conscious or not. That poem is perhaps as close as you get to it, but it's a fact that he wrote only a few lines of poetry after he left Italy for Greece. He took the uncompleted, the 17th uncompleted canto of his great comic epic poem Don Juan with him, but he never touched it.
Yeah. But he must have known when he came to Greece, to revolutionary Greece, that, when the Greeks were facing the Ottoman armies, that perhaps he was taking a risk. That he may have actually die there. That's something that, anybody who actually went to Greece at the time to fight on the side of the Greeks must have known.
Oh yes, and he often joked about the likelihood or possibility that he would die there, and obviously, like any soldier going into battle, that's very much that's part of.
Anyway, the reason why I mentioned that is that I very much enjoyed that kind of Shelley part in your book, which actually is probably half the book, if I remember correctly. So you spend a lot of time discussing that relationship, and I think it's very enlightening for the Greek reader to actually get to know the facts and what actually happened and why Byron actually decided to come to Greece.
If I could add at this point, guys, because two things closely related to that. One is, first of all, in 1821, when the revolution broke out, Shelley in Pisa, and indeed in Parea met Mavrocordato, in keeping company with Mavrocordatos, was one of the first people in Western Europe to know about the Greek Revolution. And he and his wife Mary Shelley, whom you mentioned, the author of the novel Frankenstein, were ecstatic. They were thrilled. They wrote letters to the newspapers. They tried to help Mavrocordatos, get the message out. And Shelley dedicated his next long poem, Hellas, to His Excellency Prince Mavrocordatos. By contrast, Byron, who was also living in Italy, but a different part of Italy at the time, said absolutely nothing in letters or any recorded conversation for several months afterwards.
Yeah.
We don't know when Byron first learned about it. We don't know. He never tells us what he thinks about it. There's only about 3 mentions, none more than a sentence long, in letters for more than a year after it happened. But what did happen was that, for entirely unrelated reasons, Shelley went to visit Byron where he was living in Ravenna, persuaded him to move to Pisa, where Shelley and his circle were living. And this Mavrocordatos then left for Greece. But I think it was, Shelley persuaded Byron first to join his own circle in Pisa. And I'm convinced that he worked on him, saying, you've been to Greece, which Shelley hadn't. You know all these people. You're the man of action. Why don't you do something about it? And still, Byron said nothing for months until, this is the key moment, the 8th of July, 1822, Shelley is drowned in an accident at sea. And, Shelley, a few months short of his 30th birthday. I mean, what a short life, what a tragedy.
Yeah.
Byron is utterly and deeply shocked. In a rather bizarre footnote to English literary history, I'm sure you know this story, Shelley's remains were washed up on the beach. Byron organized a kind of a Homeric funeral, where they burnt the remains of Shelley on the beach. In those days, it was, cremation was unheard of.
And Trelawney was there,
and yes, I mean, Trelawney was the sort of made it happen, but it was Byron's idea. And it's after that, and not before, after his close friend, his idealist friend, the man I think Byron always felt personally falling short of, after he had tragically died in those circumstances, suddenly Byron thought, it's a kind of unfulfilled vow. Shelley has always honoured me. I have to do this.
Yeah.
So that's when he begins to talk about actually going to Greece, and he does. I think it's a tribute to his dead friend, Shelley.
Do you think that, since we're talking about death now and the death of Shelley, do you think that Byron offered more to the Greek cause through his death than had he been alive and returned to England after the end of the revolution?
Well, we can't know that. I mean, there's a wonderful letter I found from Bishop Ignatius of Umbro-Vlachia, Metropolitis Ignatius, and he writes to console, in a spirit, this is a man of religion. He writes to console Mavrocordatos shortly after Byron's death, and he says, yes, Byron did great things for Greece. We should mourn him. But, he goes on, Itan elafromiaros os poietis. He was lightweight as a poet. And if he had lived, who knows whether what he might have gone on to do, he might have done much worse things against us than he ever did for us. And I think that's a wonderful piece of spiritual public counsel.
I had something else in mind, that with his death he turned the attention of all the Europeans on Greece. I mean, that he was, such an event of enormous circumstances and as consequences that people then began, even those who were not aware of what was happening in Greece, with his death, everybody somehow took a keen interest on what was happening in Greece.
No, I mean, I was slightly turning aside to bring in the bishop.
No, that's nice.
But I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, and in fact, I mean, a broader part of the picture, as I understand it, is that it was the actions of a small number of individual Philhellenes, volunteers like Byron, who went to Greece, and a very high proportion of them died there.
Yeah.
Who did so much to raise the profile back in their own countries, to the point where governments had to take a hand. And in this way, the strategic plan of Greek leaders such as Mavrocordatos to internationalize the conflict and bring in the great powers, that this was possible. I mean, I think the Philhellenes played an enormously important part. Not because of what they did on the ground, because they didn't win a single battle, as far as I can find out.
Yeah.
Because Byron never fought a battle at all. I think, unlike most of them, he actually did engage in a rather serious and potentially effective way in the internal politics of the Greek Revolution, but he simply didn't live long enough to do that.
Well, I'm coming now to that point. Byron's kind of, as you said, that took part in the internal politics of the Greek Revolution. You argue very convincingly that Byron decided to give the money of the British loan to what you call the modernizers against the world lords of the Peloponnese.
Yeah.
And I would like you to elaborate on this point, because it seems to me that one of the lines on which you build the entire narrative in the Greece biography of a modern nation is that there is this kind of constant fight, this constant struggle between the modernizers and, let's say, the conservatives. So in AD 24, when Byron had to decide to whom to give the money, on the one hand he was Mavrokordatos, on the other hand were the people like Kolokotronis, those who did the fighting. And probably Byron thought that Mavrokordatos would create a kind of state. Now we come to the state, a state that would be similar to, the democratic states of Europe rather than Kolokotronis. Later in your narrative, the fight could be personalized, with Trikoupis and Deligiannis, then with Venizelos and the royalists, etc. And, we can even bring the story up to recent events, with the referendum of those who wanted Greece to be in the European Union or to leave the European Union. So there is a constant fight within this nation. And that fight, it seems, from what you say, it began then, in the midst of the battle, in the midst of the revolution. You had the modernizers that sometimes they have this, in many books, especially written by Greeks, they are portrayed in a negative way. The Fanariotes, Mavrokordatos was known as o Tessaromatis because he was wearing glasses, he was wearing European clothes, in contrast to the fighters who were wearing the kilt, the fustanella, and there is always this kind of division between the two sides. Now, I want you to somehow talk about that. Why did Byron decide to give the money to Mavrokordatos? And is the British loan, as you said in another occasion when if you remember, we had the presentation of the book with John Kitmer, the then ambassador, at the Megaro Musikis, you said jokingly that this was the first mnemonio.
Oh yes, that's right. Was the first bailout for
exactly. Okay, so it's interesting because Byron had come to Greece before, and in his poems he had glorified the fighters. Like a poem like Giaour, for example. It seems that one would have expected that he would admire more people like Kolokotronis. After all, his friend Trelawney went to meet Androutsos, and he lived in the cave of Androutsos for quite a long time. He married Androutsos'
Byron didn't live long enough to know that story. But yes, Trelawney sort of went native, and actually a lot of the Philhellenes, dressed in the clothes of the place. So Mavrokordatos stuck out, because he was Greek, but he didn't.
Yeah.
No, that divide, I think, is. I think it's a very important divide. So many of those extreme characters in Byron's poems, like the Giaour, as you say, and the Corsair, they look like Kolokotronis, they look like the Cleft Armatolous, and there are many famous paintings that. There's several paintings in the vernacular. There's a famous painting that illustrates Byron's poem, The Giaour, and it's almost identical to paintings of the Greek Revolution showing these fighters. So both in costume and in their mentality, the Cleftes or the former Cleftes, the warlords as we tend to call them today, people like Kolokotronis and Androutsos, they were almost, they were Byronic heroes already in real life.
Exactly.
And indeed, I have tried to argue that the Byronic hero, as created in those fictional poems, actually derives from songs that Byron heard and stories that people told him when he was in Greece on that earlier trip. So that actually there's many the Cleftic hero. He's Faust. He's the devil. He's the transgressor.
Well, he probably Roddy met some when he went to visit Ali Pasha. So he probably met some in the court of Ali Pasha. Yeah.
he had an escort of Armaturi, and there's Hobhouse in his diary has this wonderful scene where he describes how they camped on the shore of the Ambrakikos Korpos, and they made an impromptu fire, and the bodyguard, they sang lots of songs. Now, interestingly, the songs appear to have been in Albanian, not Greek.
Yeah.
But the mentality and the idea, that Byron, and he wrote one of them down and even translated, put in Childe Harold. So, that mentality, the sort of all or nothing, do or die, the pneuma to kleftiku, the spirit of the Kleftic songs, which is all about, the personal, sort of egoismos writ large. It's, it's the individual. The self-sufficiency of the individual. That mentality is exactly the Byronic hero. But when Byron actually was on the threshold of coming to Greece, he, you remember, he actually stayed on the edge of the conflict in Kefalonia, which at the time was part of British controlled and therefore officially neutral. And he engaged in very intense correspondence with all the leaders and all the factions, the people involved in Greece. And he didn't commit himself until he found out exactly what was going on there.
Let me just add something, because I've translated the letters into Greek that Byron wrote from Kefalonia. And there's one which it's very negative on the Greeks of the time. And he writes that, that he doesn't... I'm just paraphrasing now, that probably his decision to come to Greece was wrong, but now that he's stuck. So now that he found himself in Kefalonia, he has to stay. But he was having some second thoughts about it, that because he saw that the Greeks were fighting amongst themselves, and that somehow he would not. He wasn't actually meeting the kind of people that he had in his mind.
No, absolutely, and I'm very glad to hear you say you've translated those letters. And one of the wonderful things about translation is that it's about the closest kind of reading that's possible. So I'm sure you will have gained from these letters, as I did, a clear sense of Byron's trajectory during those months. That he starts off with excitement. There's a period of about a month when he's in deep despair. He thinks the whole thing is impossible. He actually has ideas about going back. He even begins to write a poem about a man called Aristomenes.
Yeah.
He writes the whole 10 lines of it. And then new letters come from the mainland, and he sort of snaps back into his former, more optimistic mentality. But you're right. One thing about these letters, and I don't know how that strikes you as a Greek, but Byron was absolutely horrible about most people, including his friends. But he said some really nasty things about the Greeks, and yet he was on his way to risk life and lose it in the end for them.
No, but going back to the question, as you said, and although he had somehow in his poetry he had glorified the cleft, a type like Kolokotronis, at the end of the day he actually decided to give the money to somebody like Mavrokordatos.
Yes, I'm glad you remind, because I didn't tell you why he chose Mavrokordatos and not Kolokotronis. And the answer, again, you will know this from those letters, but I got quite a lot of additional information from the letters in Greek from the Mavrokordatos archive. But essentially what Byron is saying is that he's not going there as a poet. It's not about swashbuckling heroes. It's not about making a Nakani figura. He wants to do something real and political. And Byron insists, especially in writing to the Greek leaders, including Mavrokordatos, that the cause he is supporting must have legitimacy. And so he understands very quickly that there is what's called at the time the prosorini diikisis, the provisional government, which during the months he's in Kefalonia is it's holed up, it's kind of in refuge in Kranidi, perhaps not a famous name until again quite recently in the northeast Peloponnese. But anyway, the Kranidiotis, the government in the northeast Peloponnese, that is legal because it was democratically elected by the Second National Assembly at Asteros. And what Byron is looking for is a leader who will uphold the principles of democracy and the vision of what we would now call the nation state. That term wasn't available at the time, but a state centrally governed by the rule of law, with a functioning sort of social system, a functioning economy. Byron is very well aware of the importance of money in these matters, and also, and it was certainly news to people like Kolokotronis and Androutsos, and indeed to Trelawney, really good international, diplomacy.
Yeah.
And Byron fell out with some of his Philhellene colleagues, most famous, Trelawney and Stanhope, because Byron actually wanted to censor the press in Missolonghi. He said, you can't say nasty things about the monarchs of Europe, because actually you've got to create diplomatic relations with these people if the state is ever going to become part of the European family of nations. So that's all part of the business that we now in hindsight call nation building. But Byron saw that then. And it's for that reason that he chose to throw in his lot, not with the Byronic types who are all over the Greek mountains and everybody was talking about, but with the most un-Byronic of characters, Mavrokordatos, who stood only about 5 feet, 1.5 meters and a half tall. He's kondosomos me yalia tetromatos, as you say, and with his European clothes and entirely, the most unromantic figure you could imagine. Though actually, when you read some of the things he writes, I think, and in some of his portraits actually, I believe Mavrokordatos was a romantic.
Yeah.
I really, Mavrokordatos is my personal hero of the Greek Revolution. Let me get that in now.
It is, okay. No, because when you say the nation at the time, how developed was the concept of the nation? A lot of people actually would probably define themselves in a kind of much more narrow way, their village origin. We saw that in the Civil War, the Peloponnesians were slaughtering the Roumeliotes, with the same ferocity that they were slaughtering Turks, and vice versa. So the locality, and we saw also the alliances during the War of Independence. The Peloponnesi, for example, how Kolokotronis and Petrobis and Mavromichalis are together because they are from Peloponnesus. How developed was at the time the concept of the nation? How many people actually, when they were fighting for the nation? Or this was something that developed later on? Even today, sometimes, if I can say something, today even, you have old people, and when they say, θέλω να πεθάνω στην πατρίδα μου, they mean their village. That θα πεθάνω στην πατρίδα μου goes to their kind of village origin. They will go to their locality. Anyway, that's the language. But in 1825 or 24, when Byron died, how was the concept of the nation? Was it so developed that people everywhere felt that they were, Greeks of the same nation?
Well, okay, just stick with the nation. I think actually among the Greek, particularly fighters on the ground, that concept was still actually very undeveloped, because the idea of the Greek nation really develops with the Ellinikos Diafotismos, with the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
And these are people who almost none of them live in the geographical area where the revolution was successful. Though, these are the Fanariotes. Or the Fanariotes, people like Mavrokordatos, emerge out of the Greek Enlightenment. But that's an intellectual concept. On the ground, and what people are fighting for is, I think, is thriskia και πατρίδα, religion and patrida, which you're absolutely. I agree. It doesn't mean the nation at that time to most people in most contexts. It means, in the famous quote from the Makrianis begins his memoirs. I patrida mu είναι από το Λιδωρίκι. My fatherland is this tiny village.
And also Makrianis always, many times he calls the Turks apisti, the unfaithful. So there is a question of religion there, the faithful and the unfaithful.
Yeah, Turks doesn't, Turks in the Greek of that time, it doesn't mean people, it doesn't mean people like, it doesn't mean the inhabitants of modern Turkey. It basically means Muslim.
Yeah, exactly.
And almost all the Muslims in what is now Greece at the time were actually ethnically Albanians.
Let me go back to the recent book, the biography one. Do you think that the Greeks of post-independence Greece were trapped in the image that the Europeans had created about them? I'm referring here especially to the image that the Romantics had created, including Byron that we mentioned, and the obsession with the classical past. In other words, that we didn't create this new state and the new nation from scratch, but somehow, the view we had ourselves is mediated through the view that the Europeans had about us.
Very much so. I mean, I think there are some people who say that, progonoplexia and the obsession with ancestors is a sort of the curse of modern Greece and what a terrible mistake it is, and why don't you just forget about it? I don't say that at all. I mean, I rather take the view that without the ancient ancestors, the Greek Revolution could not have achieved what it did, by which I don't mean it necessarily couldn't have succeeded, but it couldn't have succeeded in the way that it did to create specifically a nation state, which would then, in my terms, be the pioneer, the example followed by so many other nation states. And the parallel here is a parallel with Serbia, because in Serbia, the local Christians rose up in 1804, again in 1815, and long before, several years before the Greek Revolution began, the Serbs had achieved a high degree of autonomy. But that autonomy did nothing to change the dynamics of the Ottoman Empire. It did nothing to change the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire. It simply meant that the local chieftain was a Christian, not a Muslim, but he ruled in exactly the same way as as Ali Pasha and all the other sort of local pashas. And Serbia, I would remind you, did not become fully independent until 1878, so half a century after Greece, although they won their autonomy first. So I could well imagine, an autonomous Peloponnese ruled by Kolokotronis in the sort of, the same style as Karagiorgi Servias or Miloš Obrenović, and possibly someone else, Odysseas Androutsos, maybe in Rumeli, and someone else in Hydra. It could have gone in different ways, but this is what brought it out in that particular way, the concept of the nation state.
Can I ask you something? I mean, so we agree that this image was in a way mediated. Perhaps it helped, the classical past, not only for us, but it helped the Europeans come to our assistance, because there were, that fight was just the Christian Greeks versus the Muslim Ottomans, but it was also we as the heir of that kind of classical past and that kind of civilization that persuaded a lot of people that the fight was worthwhile. But
could I just come back on that? Come back to because at a risk of generalizing, my impression is that for most of the Greeks involved, it was a religious war and a local war.
Yeah.
For most, if not all, of the Europeans who in various ways, and Americans, supported what they were doing, it was the other way around.
You know why I'm saying that? Because you mentioned Serbia, and I remember a funny episode when Korais wrote a letter to the Suliotes saying that they should put down their arms because they don't know the Greek language well enough, and that the revolution, they should first learn Greek and learn about the Greek culture, and then fight Ali Pasha. And we know that Korais probably thought that the revolution of 1821 was premature, that probably we should have waited until 1871 to launch the revolution after all the Greeks have been educated, they spoke Katharevousa, they knew about their classical past, etc., etc. So, in that sense, if Korais had his way, probably would have the revolution like the Serbians had. We would gain
in his autobiography, Korais said that he had, which he wrote after the revolution, he said that before the revolution, he had imagined that it would take until 1851 before the Greeks would have achieved the level of education required for their independence. And he did write some very combustible revolutionary pamphlets, which are pretty aggressive. But my impression is a lot of Korais's more philosophical writing is premised on the idea that the Greeks would be capable of winning their independence simply through the fruits of their learning and the greatness of their connecting up with the greatness of their past. That I don't know how he quite ever imagined this might happen, but I don't get the sense of Korais as a saber rattler he's in quite that aggressive sort of way.
Can I go back to this thing I've asked you about the image that we had, how this image was developed and shaped by the view that other people had about us? So this kind of idea of the others and us. And because you spent a lot of time in your book, in the recent book, the biography I'm talking about, discussing Greek identity, and you raised the question, who exactly are the Greeks? And this is a question that we have. It comes up all the time. I mean, are we Hellenes? Are we Romni, as Melina Mercouri, when she had to leave Greece, είπε είμαι μια Romia? Do we belong to Europe? Or do we belong to the Balkans and the Near East? I remember when Samuel Huntington wrote his famous book, The Clash of Civilization, that he put the Greeks outside Europe, outside Western Europe. And some of the Greeks here were very much offended by that. Others were jubilant and said, yeah, exactly, we don't belong to Western Europe. And as I said, the result of the recent referendum proved that 6 out of 10 Greeks probably think that we shouldn't belong to Europe. So what exactly, when you talk about identity, is there one identity? Because you can have a nation that somehow every individual within that nation, without that family, like a family, you identify yourself differently. So we don't have the same view about who we are. And some people will feel Europeans, other people will not feel Europeans, will feel that we belong in Kathimas Anatoli. We belong to, or because of religion, because of Orthodox religion, this is the Huntington point, we are more closely connected, let's say, to Russia, Bulgaria, Serbia, etc., to our Orthodox brothers. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do explicitly reply to Huntington in the introduction to my book. I quote that line, and my answer, which I say there, is that the truth is that the Greeks, modern Greeks, do belong to Europe for the reason that they made a conscious choice to do so. But the fact they did make that choice.
Yeah, but don't you see
they're not part of Europe.
Sorry, Roddy, don't you see that there are still tensions about that? That's not a problem. That a problem that has been resolved. That all the Greeks, would agree with your view.
I agree there are tensions, and I mean, again, both in the introduction at the very end of the book. I mean, I try to elaborate on that, and again, I mean, please remember, I was writing this in the first place for people who know little or nothing about Greece and Greeks, rather than for people like you and probably most listeners tonight who know far more than I do. But of course it matters, and I think this kind of double identity is enormously important. It's part of what I perceive as Greek identity. But the way I try to explain it in the book is that it's not a zero-sum choice, either West or East, either European or Anatolitico, but it's actually both and.
Yeah.
Depending, what bit of history you're looking at, or even which direction you're looking at, or what clothes you're wearing, or what kind of language you're speaking in, you might tend to look more in one direction or more than the other. And I suggested, again, I mean, it's perhaps something, this is perhaps the Kseni Matia, the sort of view from abroad, because I can't put myself exactly in the position of you or a Greek. I have so many my Greek friends. My suggestion was that actually this dividing line, or I called it a fault line in the book, which actually goes back to Mavrokordatos and Kolokotronis, it's not so much that individuals stand on one side or the other, or to extremes or not, but actually the fault line, it probably runs right through communities, families, even in some cases individuals. So, it's not, are we Eastern or are we Western, but in what proportion am I personally Eastern or Western? And actually,
but there are some people. There are some people who, for whom this kind of division is clear cut. I mean, let me remind you that when the European Union issued that order, when Simitis was Prime Minister, that in our identity cards we should include the religion, the then Archbishop of Athens, Christodoulos, launched a campaign in which he actually, this petition was signed by 3 million Greeks, that the religion should be, the Greek Orthodox religion should be part of the ID card, forgetting, of course, that in Greece we also have Catholics, we have Muslims, we have Jews, we have people of other religions, and the Orthodox religion was actually, the basic, somehow, problem for Christodoulos and those who signed the petition. So, if you ask those 3 millions, for them, at that time, Europe was the enemy that was trying to I suppose, liquidate the Greek identity or harm the Greek identity, whatever.
Oh yes, and I mean there are many similar examples. I mean, during the wars in Yugoslavia, where so many Greeks and even people in the Greek government, stepped out of line with Europe and NATO in supporting the
Milosevic. Of Milosevic.
Milosevic, yes, it was
specifically. It wasn't just.
It was not a very admirable character, by any standards, but I think orthodoxy, the shared faith, mattered more. But so yes, I mean that divide, it's still there, but I would dispute that 60% of Greeks don't want to be part of Europe. I mean that referendum.
No, I know. It was the way it was put was it was like a kind of the wrong way. But there are what is interesting is. Which in a way is disturbing. When we had the refugee crisis, we still have, a lot of refugees, when they actually arrived from Syria and other places, and they came to the islands, let's say, Mytilene, etc., and they appeared on television, some kind of journalists went there to interview them, all of them said, we don't want to stay in Greece, we want to go to Europe. As if Greece was not Europe. Greece was just a stepping stone for them to go to Europe. And that was, pretty annoying. I mean, that they were in Greece, and for them, Greece was just a transit place, to go to Europe.
I didn't know that, and I wonder where that came from. Because
I don't know.
Greece is part of Europe, and they're supposed to be applying for asylum in Greece. But, I mean, what that reminds me of, Greece and Britain are the only two countries that I know in which Europe can be either part of us or the opposite.
Exactly.
In Britain we talk about going to Europe, or now we're leaving Europe. But in Greece too, Pamis tis Evropes, we're going to Europe. It's a kind of, for many Greeks, Europe is a different place.
Yeah.
But I think that perception.
Well, for you now, Roddy, it's okay because after Brexit you're not part of Europe, but for us it's different.
Yeah, but
you probably solved that existential dilemma now. You're not part of Europe anymore.
We can't stop being part of Europe, and Brexit, in a fundamental sense, actually is impossible to deliver.
Let me finish this discussion because time is pressing. I just want to ask you a final question. You remember, and we mentioned it, the title of the book of Kostas Kostis is «Τα κακομαθημένα παιδιά της ιστορίας». I don't know, I think probably it was translated «The Spoiled Children of History», if I remember correct, the English translation. You seem to have a different view of that. I mean, from reading your book, the Greece biography of a modern nation, you don't think that we are the κακομαθημένα παιδιά της ιστορίας, the spoiled children of history, rather we are I suppose, the gifted children of history?
Well, and actually, why not? Now, to be honest, I never quite saw the point of Kostis' choice of title. And that phrase from Zambelius, which he quotes in the Greek edition, he comments on it a little bit, but there's no explanation. But he doesn't really explain, how he understands it or what he means, what he thinks Zambelius meant in 1859, I think it was. But it sort of suggests, the sort of Grignari, and the well-worn story that what you said earlier, that the revolution succeeded, but didn't really succeed because the Europeans sort of gave with one hand, took it all away with the other hand.
Yeah.
But then, how independent is any sovereign state really? I mean, just look at Brexit.
There are degrees of dependency. Some states are very dependent and some are less dependent. Yeah.
It's Rousseau in the social contract. Individuals come together to pool their sovereignty for the benefit of all. And even quite large states like Britain can never be totally sovereign and independent in the sense that everything they do can be done with no account taken of any other state on the planet. I mean, even Trump's America has rather spectacularly failed in that experiment, surely.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, no, I'm not going to compare Trump with Kolokotronis. It would degrade Kolokotronis' memory. But the eclectic idea of complete autonomy, absolute self-sufficiency, we can stand alone and, we defy everyone, even Charos, until we just die. That mentality, it's a heroic mentality, and it is part of the Greek sort of national mythology, part of Greek history. But it's not a way to build a successful, functioning nation state, is it?
Well, I suppose, I mean, if I can take the analogy to extreme, today we had some kind of poll results. They asked, the Greeks were asked whether they're going to, you know, when the vaccine comes out, when they're going to be injected with the vaccine, and 70% of the Greeks, 68 I think, said yes, and 32 said no. So perhaps 32% feels that either that this virus has been over-exaggerated, or it doesn't exist, or they are prepared as heroes to face it without the vaccine.
Tokismeti, as you say in Greek.
Tokismeti, or perhaps a more heroic kind of confrontation with that kind of virus. Is there anything else? Because I think we're running out of time. Is something that, I mean, I tried to raise some points, trying to combine and connect in both books that you wrote. Personally, because of my love for Shelley, I have to say, I have to admit that I found your Byron book fascinating, and I very much enjoy that. It's interesting that you know, when people actually, when I was a student and we heard the name Beaton was the person who was always dealing with Greek literature. But you surprised us. First of all, I remember when I was still a student, you wrote a novel. And then now, your last books, you're having a different mantle. I mean, you're not the literature man that everybody knew, that now you are more of a historian, or,
Well, I mean, this is something that I think with you yourself, as a marvelous poet and a highly professional historian, I think are probably well placed to understand.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, I began with literature, and my professional life really was. I mean, I studied English literature, not history, for my first degree. And that's the other thing. I mean, I'm very hesitant about the biography as a title. I'm still rather hesitant about calling myself a historian, though actually my next book does have the word history in the title.
What is your next book?
I've earned it. The next title, Miguelas, the next book is called The Greeks, A Global History. And it begins in 1500 BCE, and it ends in 2021.
Okay. That's a huge project.
And it's finished. It's just going to press.
You finish it?
Oh. It's going to come out next year.
Do you know the Greek word chalkenderos? That's what you are. I don't know how, I can't now think of the translation into English of chalkenderos, but I think that's what you are.
I know exactly what you, well, thank you. I take it as a compliment.
It is a compliment.
Thank you.
Okay, so is there anything else you would like to raise at this point? It seems that, they told me that we have to finish at 8 o'clock. It's 3 past, it's almost 5 past 8, but I think people have forgotten us, so we can actually stay here forever, I think, if nobody stops us.
Well, perhaps that's not a kindness to our listeners. We should. They might want to tune into the next program. But I mean, I've really enjoyed this conversation, guys.
Me too.
It's just such a pity we're not meeting in person. I suppose the only consolation is, I mean, we can't see behind the screen how many people there are out there, but it's nice to think there might be even more of them than there could possibly have been in any one space at the Thessaloniki International Book Fair.
Yeah. No, and also we didn't have, in the Thessaloniki Book Fair, if you remember, there are many places at the same time, many lectures that, that run simultaneously, and sometimes there's a lot of noise. And at least in this discussion, we had no, it was just us. So there's no noise, nothing. It's pretty civilized. Okay, so thank you very much for being here, and I hope that the discussion satisfied you, the debate we had. I think we raised some points, not all of them, and I would recommend to the Greek listeners to read both of your books, both the Byron and the Greece biography. They're very enlightening, and they're going to learn a lot about aspects of Greek history and also something about their own identity. So thank you very much, Roddy. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Bye.